In today's true crime video, we will be bringing awareness to victim Joseph Daniel Casolaro, also known as Danny. This is Danny. He was a freelancer writer who loved journalism and true crime. Danny was heavily invested in this particular case, conspiracy case, might I add. This dangerous case was called inslaw case, also known as the case to drive a sane man to his madness. And if you know about the rabbit hole that conspiracy cases will have you in, it almost seems impossible to get out of. One case may be connected to another and then another, like this particular case that Danny was deep diving in. It was so deep that there was different lanes to each case, but all cases were connected. And Danny named this case the Octopus Case. Now, doing one case is enough consumption for me personally, but I can't imagine the mindset behind a numerous amount of cases all connected to each other at one time. For months, Danny isolated himself to work obsessively on this dangerous case. And as a true crime writer myself, I know the importance of not internalizing these cases and creating a balance so that it doesn't consume or take over your mind. But Danny didn't care about that. So much so, the Octopus murders drove him to his demise. And on August 10th, 1991, he was found in a tub with his wrist slashed and a suicide letter. Welcome back to another episode of Jazzy Times Crime. This is the case of the Octopus murders. Danny grew up in a Catholic family in McLean, Virginia as the second of 6 kids. And sadly, he faced some tough times early on. One sibling died shortly after birth. And in 1971, his younger sister, Lisa, tragically passed away from a drug overdose in San Francisco. He attended Providence College until 1968, where he eventually met Terrell Pace, a former Miss Virginia. They got married and had a son named Trey, but after 10 years, they divorced, with Danny getting legal custody of their son. So outside of family life, he had a bunch of interests. He was into amateur boxing. He loved writing poems and short stories, and even raised purebred Arabian horses. Now, on the journalism side, he dabbled in some serious topics like the Soviet naval presence in Cuba and the Castro intelligence network, as well as the Chinese smuggling of the opium into the U.S. However, it's unclear how much of his work has been publicized, but he did publish a novel called The Ice King. And after stepping back from journalism in the late 70s, he shifted gears and started acquiring trade publications in the computer industry, which was a very popular field because computers had just came out. But that was short-lived because in the early 90s, he decided to dive back into journalism and got really interested in the inslaw case. And walking into his room, you could visually see the mental web he was stuck in. There was papers everywhere, news articles, clippings, and handwritten notes that was a little hard to read. Like he was rushing. And on August 10th, 1991, while out of town on a mission to track this case, he was found in a bathtub at the Sheraton Hotel with his wrist slashed, suicide letter, and an empty beer bottle. The medical examiner ruled his death a suicide. I think it's worth mentioning that Danny was writing a book about international crimes, and he wanted to start with the inslaw case. Now, this case was not a fun walk in the park adventure. It was eventually labeled as the deaths of insanity, and it is believed that the true story of Danny's death began when he had the urge to crack the inslaw case for his book. And that began when he interviewed Bill and Nancy Hamilton, owners of a computer software company called inslaw. This is Bill and Nancy. They created a software for computers called Promis. Now, what this software did was it helped law enforcement manage criminal cases easier. It had every criminal's information and how to track them across the nation. The software was such a helpful and groundbreaking tool that Bill and Nancy were awarded a $10 million contract to install this software in the United States Justice Department. Now, this was a powerful piece of software because, as stated before, computers were very new at the time. So all the criminal cases were papers in a box. So imagine a room of boxes And in the boxes, it's a whole bunch of files. And now you have all of these files in one computer. That is so convenient. It just seems like an easier flow for law enforcement, FBI, and so on. Bill and Nancy was finally seeing the fruits of their hard labor until the United States Justice Department stopped paying them. They stopped paying them in the second year of their contract, which left Bill and Nancy filing for bankruptcy, and their company was now gone. They hired lawyers to sue the United States Justice Department, and thanks to Judge Benson, the government had to pay Bill and Nancy $6.8 million for using their software by trickery, deceit, and fraud. Happy ending, right? Well, 3 months later, Judge Benson, the same judge that ordered the government to pay $6.8 million to the Hamiltons, got fired. He was very startled by this, and furthermore startled that the attorney that argued in the government's defense was now promoted. Next thing you know, the justice took back the ruling of the Hamilton winning that case and said the inslaw company pursued its claims in the wrong court. So now this case has been dismissed and inslaw now gets nothing, which of course makes everyone wonder, why are they doing this to these people and what are they hiding? So now no one wants to help the Hamiltons in fear of losing their job until Mr. Danny comes along, who already loves journalism and computers, and he teams up with Bill Hamilton to help him write about it. It wasn't until Danny started investigating and matching powerful names and faces to each other that he realized this was more than a breach of contract. And the real reason behind the theft of the software was to benefit Earl Brian. This is Earl. He owned a corporation that does contracts for the Justice Department and the CIA. He was also the officer of a computer firm that competed with inslaw and had offered to buy inslaw, and Danny was able to prove all of this with wire transfers. They were selling the software, and Danny opened up a world of disturbing conspiracies, and the things Danny learned about blew his mind. So during the investigation, Bill gets a call from a man named Michael Riconosciuto. I hope I said that right. This is Michael. Calling from a payphone, he tells Bill, I have the code to break into your Promis software. Bill passes the information to Danny, and Danny and Michael then start to communicate. Now, a little bit about Michael. His knowledge of chemistry, laser physics, and computer software was impressive. And at the age of 10, he was in an article about how much of a genius he was. By the age of 16, a lot of powerful people noticed him and how he used his smarts for evil. Now, Michael is a big essential to this inslaw case because the government initially hired Michael because he had connections in Iran. And they sent Michael and another man named Earl Brian, who was working in the Ronald Reagan election campaign. And they went into Iran to buy out the Iran's government for $40 million. Not only that, Iran had American hostages, but the government didn't want them to be released until after the election. They felt like timing was important and it would help Ronald Reagan win the election. And what do you know? The hostages were released within hours of the election. And now that Ronald Reagan had won the election, Earl is like, where's my money? The government had promised Earl millions of dollars if he traveled to Iran and made that deal happen. So Earl was ready for his pay cut. Well, the government was like, we have something better for you. Instead of paying you in cash, we will pay you with a software called Promis. Now, are y'all following? This is the same Promis software that they took from Bill and Nancy and stopped paying them. And instead, they're like, oh, it's ours now. We don't have to continue to pay you. Instead, we're going to give it to somebody because we owe them money for helping us rig the election. Everybody caught up? Cool. This Promis software is worth millions of dollars. And so this is how they were able to sell it to Earl. And it's the same software that the government stole from the Hamiltons. But the reason why this Promis software was so special and worth giving to Earl is because they had hired Michael to break into the software and create a trap door where a third party can use to break into a system. So the plan was to take this software, sell it to other countries, but spy on them through the trap door that Michael had put in the software to see what their next moves are. A lot of CIA from around the world had purchased this software. So that's why it was so much secrecy, because of this global, it was basically a global surveillance camera for the government. Another case on the tentacles of the octopus murders was the Cabazon Tribe, when Michael had high technology projects on an Indian reservation where they cover up what they were doing by building cigarette shops, poker casinos, and Promis software was one of the high technology projects they were working on underneath these businesses. However, there was a lot more softwares other than Promis that now did this same thing. So now do you see how deep of a rabbit hole you can fall into trying to crack this case? A case about the government at that. The Cabazon Tribe case was gamblers, arm dealers, the mafia, and even CIA agents trading in dope, dirty money, and weapons, and even murder for the underground empire. And an Indian guy named Fred found out what they were doing on his Indian reservation and hired a lawyer, and unfortunately was dead in his backyard the day he was supposed to meet with his lawyer. 3 people were shot in the head, and before justice was even served, they closed the case and stopped investigating with no explanation. And by March of 1991, Michael wrote a sworn affidavit to Bill Hamilton about the role he played in helping the government hacking the Promis software. And 7 days later, he is in prison for drug charges and doing the longest bid ever than anyone who really had drugs. The local police did not arrest him. So that's how you know it was the government, because Michael, how dare you? We hired you. You got paid to do dirty work for us, and now you're exposing us? Oh, we could just say, we pulled you over and found drugs on you. Now you're in jail for a very long time. Same department that hired him locked him up. So many cases were all connected, which is why Danny called this the Octopus Case, because all of the cases were a tentacle of the inslaw. So Michael had told Danny, whatever you do not talk to Robert Nichols. But Robert Nichols was the last piece to Danny's octopus story to complete his book. And Danny went from computer journalist to investigating international spy networks. He wanted to see how it all started and who was all involved, which was John Nichols, who destroyed the Cabazon Tribe, and George Bush was one of them, the vice president of Raegan, who paid Iran to keep the hostages until he won. Another one was Richard Helms. He was the director of the CIA, and he destroyed the MK Ultra file that did a secret drug testing. Another case connected to this was Howard Hunt, who was a part of the CIA and broke into the Watergate. Another one was George Pender and Robert Nichols, who rebuilt Lebanon. Ted Shakely and Tom Clines were the CIA involved in the secret bombing of Laos during the Vietnam War and also Iran. Ray Klein, another CIA. There was so many conspiracies, and Danny was so close to tying them all together, but he was so consumed. He was no longer fun. He was no longer full of energy, but now was tired and only wanted to talk about this case to family and friends. And everyone that Danny interviewed would warn him that this was a dangerous game he was playing, but that did not stop Danny. Danny started getting unknown phone calls with death threats to stop trying to get information or else. And at his nephew's birthday party, he told his brother, if something happens to me, it was not an accident. But he was anxious and determined to meet an unknown source out of town about more information on this case. And this piece of information was the last small missing piece that was going to crack the case. So the day before his death, the waitress at a restaurant said she saw Danny waiting with papers prepared for a meeting, but whoever he was supposed to be meeting never showed up. And Danny sat there for a while looking really disappointed before he just left. So in August 10th, 1991, when he committed, the family did not find out until 2 days later. And when the family asked for an autopsy, they told him his body had already been embalmed and it's too late. His left arm had 8 cuts and the right had 4 cuts, deep enough to where the tendons were separated. So there's no way this man did that 8 times and then used that same arm to cut into his other arm 4 more times. He also had a big brown briefcase with all the information notes from the inslaw case, and that was gone. By the time Danny was found, there was not one trace of a piece of paper in that hotel room. What was once labeled as the friends and family of Danny had the case reopened to investigate foul play. And Danny's brother did several interviews to tell everyone that Danny was working on a case to expose the government. Robert Nichols, who is a part of Danny's Octopus investigation, called Danny's brother to send condolences. He ended the phone call with, Danny was playing a dangerous game and I told him to back off. And maybe you should do the same. And although they reopened the case, they still labeled it as no proof of homicide and went back to the original cause of death, which was suicide, because he had believed a fake story was real by people that was just messing with his head, that he blew all his money traveling and meeting with people. And the one piece of evidence he thought was his last connection, he was so determined about, it ended up being a no-show meeting. And he went back to his hotel room and realized he was in over his head and committed due to confusion and paralysis. And the only person we know that was in that hotel room that would have did this was Danny. There are 2 men who are a part of a Netflix documentary called The Octopus, and they are out in request for Danny's spouse. They are also consumed with the octopus, might I add, and they found a letter from a witness who had the hotel room next to Danny's that saw another man with Danny go into the hotel room. Well, this letter never made it to the news or FBI report. And she wrote this when he first, quote unquote, committed. Netflix has a documentary, as I stated before, called The Octopus Murders. And it's unfortunate. It's a little incomplete and disappointing. There's never a happy ending in true crime cases, but at the end of the day, you can't say unsolved, because the solved is he committed. So that's the ending of it. I personally don't like the incompleteness of it, but yeah, go check that movie out. And I just feel like the family can now rest knowing that they have at least gave Danny's side of the story. For more true crime cases stories, you can click right here, or to subscribe to the channel so that you never miss another video, click right here. I love you, and we shall talk again in the next episode of Jazzy Times Crime.